So thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to have received this invitation and to talk a bit about some of this work on here at ICBO. And also, I'm very happy that this talk will be copied and shown at CCBOT, which I attended 3 years ago, just before the pandemic. And I hope there will be a chance to go to China again as well. So I was planning, we don't have much time, so I was planning for a rather lengthy introduction on coevolution. So coevolution is essentially a kind of evolution where two or more species evolve together, such as flowers and bees, which evolve jointly, so that, for example, they fit better one or the other, and they merge together. And in particular, I wanted to explore a bit how bioinformatics or biology and bio-ontologies have evolved together, and in particular, what this is going to mean for ontologies and for how ontologies should evolve next with the emergence of machine learning and AI methods in biology and in biomedicine now. So I will try to keep this relatively short, this part, just because we don't have that much time before we go a bit into the machine learning. But I'll still start a bit with some coevolution, and I have to start with how this all started, which was basically, in terms of timeline we had in biology or in bioinformatics, we had the first eukaryotic organisms which were sequenced, which was the yeast and the worm. And this was before human or mouse genome sequence was completed. And ontologies, bio-ontologies, or the modern bio-ontologies that we are working with now, they emerged as a response to this development. So the gene ontology, explicitly, when you read this paper, was developed as a response to these eukaryotes being sequenced. So I have a couple of quotes from this paper, from this Go paper, which started around 1998-ish. And if we have this, then functional conservation requires a common language for annotation, and it kind of reads very old, or we may not be surprised anymore that genes are highly conserved between different organisms. But at the time when the first eukaryotes were actually sequenced, this was really surprising to a lot of people. First of all, there were not that many genes that a lot of people expected, and then they were really conserved. And this meant that we needed to find a language to talk about functions, because these functions would also be conserved. So ontologies, or the gene ontology, arose as a response to this insight that there's a very high degree of sequence and functional conservation between different organisms. And that it became an ontology was a very practical design decision, basically to allow this transfer of annotation, even though proteins would be at different levels, we would be at different levels of knowledge. So we cannot have something that is maybe not otherwise specified, because then it would be invalidated once it becomes more specific, and so on. So this was a clear response to how our knowledge evolved in this time. So also quotes from this paper. And now something happened. So gene ontology emerged and something else happened. So I just briefly abbreviate this with microarray experiments here, but it's really not just microarray experiments what happened in biology. It's very simplified. But what I mean is, people came around and they found like lots of interesting lists of genes, and they wanted to know what they do. And this led to a lot of foundational work in bio-ontologies research. So just very, very briefly, I'll try to explain how I think this led to this change or evolution of bio-ontologies. So just very briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with an enrichment analysis, for example, or an ontology enrichment analysis, the question is, you're giving a set of genes. Maybe they are genes which you found over or underexpressed, or they have some other characteristics in common, and you want to find out what characterizes this list. What happens is, you use the gene ontology here on the left, And because you have this inference in the gene ontology, they propagate all the way to molecular function. So here you have protein binding to molecular function, and so on. And then you perform a statistical test, basically your list of genes versus all other genes for each of these functions. And then in the end, you see if there's something very specific about a particular function, and you rank this and you get these nice lists. So genes which are overrepresented in certain processes or under up or down regulated in processes. So it's a statistical test, lots of interesting statistical questions about enrichment analysis to ask, not important here. But the key point that I want to make is that to have a successful interpretation of a gene list, something that is accurate and scientifically accurate, requires that our propagation rules in the ontology are also accurate. If they are wrong, then our interpretation of our experiment will also be wrong. And there's a second feature, and I'm not going to go much into this, it's semantic similarity measures. It's a little bit later, but they use the similar kind of principle. It's basically just one basic similarity measure here. And I'm going to be relatively brief. The idea is you want to compare two things with respect to an ontology. So semantically compare two things. And what happens is, for example, you want to compare red and green. And this is just one of many different semantic similarity measures. You can, for example, say their similarity is some kind of specificity measure of their, where am I? Wow, okay. Some specificity measure of their most informative common ancestor. And again, not important which specific similarity measure we are using here, only that it's important that the common ancestors are actually accurate and that we aggregate or propagate our genes or things that are annotated to our classes correctly across this hierarchy. So this was semantic similarity. There are many other things. So first person was Phil Lord. In 2003, this was the first paper for retrieval on databases, but other people have used this for predicting disease genes for differential diagnosis. So some using guilt by association principle. From Peter Robinson's group, there was the phenomizer for patients based on rare diseases, looking at this and so on. So there are many uses of this, but all of them relied on accurate inferences. So something happened now in bioinformatics that a lot of methods that actually crucially rely on ontologies being accurate were developed. And this is where ontologies had to evolve with these analysis methods. So basically the key property here was that our propagation was accurate. So this true path rule, as the gene ontology called it, but it was reformulated and reformulated, was essentially accurate. So our aggregation of the annotations along taxonomy and partonomy was correct, because incorrect inferences would also result in incorrect scientific conclusions and interpretations. And this is where, and in response to this, may not have been seen like this by everybody, but in response to this, a lot of the foundations were laid mainly by people like Barry Smith and many others as well, about correcting things that were inherently wrong in ontologies. And a lot of the ontological principles come from a time where ontology, so from around mid-2000s, where a lot of this was fixed. And then more things happened. And so this was a great time because a lot of things were fixed and things became better and more correct. Our inferences improved. And then biology changed again a little bit. So we now had high throughput experiments, and we had a lot more areas where we wanted ontologies. And ontologies somehow had to deal with big data. And dealing with big data, it's of course a very biased way here in which I put this timeline, but dealing with big data, what does this actually mean for ontologies? How can they cope with this? So there was now a demand in response to these high throughput technologies. We got a lot more detailed knowledge and in a lot more domains. So we needed more ontologies, and they needed to do more. They needed to have lots of subdomains, lots of people with some specific needs started working on different parts or different niches, and they all wanted some part of their ontology to actually just fit them. And the problem was that just manually creating these ontologies, entirely manually, simply wouldn't scale much, except maybe for the gene ontology, which is probably the best funded ontology ever. So at this point, a lot of changes happened. So ontologies were not only primarily developed manually anymore, but a lot of automated methods came. So a lot of axiomatization to support ontology development and ontology construction, ontology design patterns. So the first ontology design patterns, lexical patterns. So people used lexical patterns on labels to auto-generate axioms and then tested whether decomposing these terms would actually give the correct classification with some reasoner and so on. So this was nice. And it kind of helped ontologies to scale, but they also relied on tools to validate this, mainly automated reasoners to test whether these ontologies are consistent. And the problem is, as the ontologies would grow, they would also not scale very well anymore. So what happened then is some modularization techniques came, different ones, but Myriad is one of them. It's very widely used in our community. So we had a lot of technical and social details where we changed and we basically modularized. We built smaller modules which would fit in our tools, and we switched some of our tools. So we used not Hermit, not Palette at the time. Palette, I don't know if who remembers Palette, but it was the go-to reasoner. It was the first OWL complete reasoner. But we switched to different tools like ELK and maybe Conclude now, and we had a lot of new tools and new reasoners coming up. But we had to give something up. We had to give up a lot of expressivity at the time when doing this. And as a consequence of this, and I'm getting closer to what I'm actually going to talk about, as a consequence of this, what happened is that consistency of our ontologies and all mutual consistency of our ontologies was simply no longer an attainable goal. And this is a very recent result, and it's still current. So it's a result from 2 years ago, so by Luke Slater mainly, in the collaboration with George Gutos, where we simply tested the mutual consistency of ontologies in the OBO Foundry. The first one is just taking the certified OBO Foundry ontologies, just putting them all in one big ontology and classifying them and counting the number of unsatisfiable classes. So you can see there are quite a few, but if you add some other ontologies, so if you add in particular the larger OBO world the ontologies, then what you can see is that there is no logical consistency anymore. And if you would really rely on logical consistency, if this was necessary for anything, logical consistency, then these ontologies, our ontologies, would not work. And so this is something to keep in mind, that as ontologies grew and as we automated more and we lowered the threshold of our tools just because they had to be lowered, otherwise we wouldn't be able to get anything done, we gave up something very crucial, if we ever had this, which I'm not fully sure. But at least it seems that it's very difficult to achieve this now. And then something else happened, and it followed exactly in this line. I call this clinical integration, but I'm not really sure this is really the driving factor, but we went more into biomedical parts. It was a lot of ontology development was driven from model organism, basic biology initially, but it was a lot more medical, a lot more applied. And what happened was on ontology side, we moved into knowledge graphs. And I make a distinction, I will explain this distinction between knowledge graphs and ontologies, because it's important to me and maybe to some of us as well. So let me explain what I mean by this. And so for a knowledge graph, what we do is we generate a graph, and I think most of you know what a knowledge graph is. We generate a graph which is focused on linking pieces of information or types of entities or entities. We don't specify necessarily what they are. So they are focused on linking, so on relatedness or association, not on semantics or explaining what specifically this relationship means. And for me, this is a crucial difference between a knowledge graph and an ontology. So there are, however, ways in which ontologies interoperate. So ontologies and knowledge graphs, they are not disjoint. We have seen in this conference already many talks which basically say our knowledge graphs, ontologies, they are basically the same thing. We don't need to distinguish them. So now we can project ontologies onto graphs. So basically, if for those of you who come from gene ontology, 1999, this was a graph. We started a graph. We had edges between classes that said part of and so on. This was It was generated as DAGEdit in a tool called DAGEdit. It was a graph editor. And then we went into OWL. We actually formalized what we meant by this. This was part of this big foundation era of ontologies. And now we spend a lot of time getting graphs back from our ontologies so that they interoperate with knowledge graphs. So we have these projection patterns here on the left. This is from a method called OWL to back star by Ian Horrocks group. But on the right, I took an obographs, which is quite similar. It's a bit more sophisticated because it has these modules and so on, but it does essentially something very similar. It takes some OWL axioms and projects them into a graph so that we get relatedness or linkedness back while giving up semantics. So we get something that looks like this, again, from the obographs GitHub. So I took this graph. So this is a part where an ontology can look like this. The different colors of the edges are different names of relations. Then we get knowledge graphs like this. That is fine. And we still have a lot of knowledge graphs. Now we have actually, maybe arguably, we have more knowledge graphs than we have ontologies being published. And even in our community, there is very rarely a distinction. So we have ontologies or knowledge graphs. Some of us may use this interchangeably. Fine. And so this is, so we have these back, and we have a lot of linkedness or interlinking. And now we have this surge of machine learning and AI. And yes, so Bill Hogan has explained very well. Of course, ontologies are a part of AI, but I'm trying to, there is a different part of AI now that is entering biology, medicine, many other domains, which has the major impact, and it's not the ontologies. So this is why I put this here on the left. So the part that is mostly related to statistical learning or machine learning. And the question is, and this is the key question that I am trying to answer or trying to explore, not just in this talk, but in my research for the last 8 years, perhaps, is what would ontologies have to do, and what do we need in order to make ontologies more relevant for something that is happening now and that is transforming really biomedicine. So, okay, the question is, and this is something that ontologies clearly do, and I think all of us agree, is that ontologies are crucial to provide and collect high-quality data for machine learning. So even aggregation over the hierarchy is something that is critically important for machine learning. Now, so, but the question that I have is that whether ontologies really will only be data providers. So is this what we are? Are we basically generating nice data sets for machine learning, and that is it? And I go back one step and look at cool things that people are doing with knowledge graphs. So this is something not really related to ontologies at all. It's something that people do with knowledge graphs. So I take a method on the left. It's called trans-E, or translating embedding. The idea is, and it's a knowledge graph where you have relations. So it's basically head, relation, tail, or subject, predicate, object, depending which community you're coming from. You give them different names. And this method, what it tries to do is, for every single such assertion, so for every triple in RDF, it tries to make sure that some kind of embedding of head, and embedding here is just taking some kind of vector, a set of or a sequence of numbers that you assign to it, and you can randomly assign to it. And what it tries to make sure is that the embedding of the head plus the embedding of the relation equals the embedding of the tail, or alternatively, that head plus relation minus tail equals 0. So is this 0 vector? Is this 0 vector for every single triple? So for every fact that is asserted in our knowledge graph. So this is for all triples in the graph, for every relation subject, predicate, object for every head, relation, tail, triple. So if you do something like this, you can do two things. First, you get these very nice figures. We have seen some of them. So this is basically a principal component analysis, and then it's PC1 versus PC2, or PC2 as a function of PC1, or Tesny, which is some kind of linear some kind of neural network based principal component analysis. And what you get is, for example, this comes from the gene ontology transformed into a graph. So the knowledge graph or the obo graph from gene ontology. And then what you can do is, well, you can color the three hierarchies. And what you see is, yeah, you get a big blue blob, a big yellow blob, and a big red blob. And you can also cluster them. You get something slightly different. Okay, that's fine. You will have seen many of those kind of plots. What it tells you is maybe some kind of relatedness or similarity in this kind of space. So you can explore this like a semantic similarity measure. And you can, of course, do something like prediction of links or link prediction. You can do this with so this is from a different, it's from one of an earlier paper of mine, but it's essentially, you can, in this graph, you can try to predict edges, new edges, using basically the same principle. So if you have a new head, and so if you have a head and a relation, you just predict what it will probably stand in relation to. So you can do this. This works really well, and this is something that has really entered bioinformatics. Not just ontologies, it has nothing to do with ontologies, but in bioinformatics. This is something that is used. You will find hundreds of papers which use these kind of knowledge graph embeddings, link prediction, or other kind of predictive methods. You'll find, if you just read, I don't know, Bioinformatics, the journal, you'll probably find in the last month 10 papers that use these methods. So it's something that is really widely used on knowledge graphs, and it's a form of machine learning, of course. But ontologies are not just these graphs, they do something else. In particular, ontologies do something very crucial, and they do something crucial that knowledge graphs don't, and this is they enable deductive inference. Deductive inference means I assert a set of facts that are true, and from this I can identify facts or statements which are necessarily true if whatever I have asserted is true. So this is true for any ontology formalized in a logic-based language. And we can use these deductive inferences to do a lot of different things. In particular, we can ask quite complex questions and queries. So queries about disjointness, negation, existential, universal quantifiers, and so on. We can also test consistency. And none of this really makes much sense in knowledge graphs. You get on knowledge graphs, you get a kind of deductive inference. You can hard code some kind of rules, but it's really just composition of edges. This is what you get. Nothing like what we get or what we expect from ontologies. And you have some model theory and a model theory. And I'm going to use this just very briefly to show you some how we can connect ontologies and neural networks. So model theory is essentially our theory of truth, or it's a way in which we would express the semantics of a logical language. And what we do is we define some algebraic structures which kind of represent the world, or how the world should be, if all the statements in our ontology are true. That's basically what model theory is trying to do. So the problem that we are facing, or that I faced maybe 5 years ago, was that there's really not much in terms of neural networks or in any other machine learning methods which can really use any of these properties: deductive inference, reasoning, or exploiting consistency. So we need to develop these methods. And this is what I and my group and my colleagues have started to do. So the first thing was EL embeddings, or it was a method called EL embeddings. We look at EL embeddings. The idea of EL embeddings was that we need some kind of world model. We need to represent, or we need to have a way a model of the world, so that we can know which facts we believe to be true, and then we can infer facts that must also be true in a world where all our facts that we know to be true are true. So the question is, can we embed a neural network? Can we give it some form of a world model? And for this, we have designed a set of what we call model generating embeddings. I'm not going into details here very much. I'm going to show you how they work. Yes, I'm going to show you how they work. So the idea is you have a very basic ontology on the right. I write this here in description, logic, syntax, but you have this very basic ontology, and then you get some kind of space. This is a two-dimensional space here, but normally for a neural network, you can think of the space as like weights of a layer of neural networks, but it's essentially a way in which you can design a set of representations for each of them. It's some correspondence, such that all these relations are preserved. And I'll show you. So here, for example, this red circle is male, and you see that this is on the left. It's visualizing this optimization process, how this neural network is finding how to assign some kind of values or embeddings to these different classes, and then it will end when male becomes a person, because we have male as a subclass of person here. And in this model on the left, you can read off more relationships than you have asserted. You get, for example, transitivity of the subclass for free, because male subclass person means that this male sphere needs to lie in this yellow person sphere. And then if you have a father which is male, so you see there's a father male, it's kind of here in the intersection, it's this tiny little thing here. It will always remain in there, and you can get the inference that a father is a person for free from this model. So this neural network will be able to make to compute this entailment. And this was very nice until we realized that, of course, this is one world or one model. And the problem is that one single world structure is not enough. We actually need many, because some things in this one world structure may be accidentally true, and we want to know which of these are accidentally true, which of them are necessarily true. So we need to distinguish between whether a fact is true in some worlds or in all worlds. And this is the basic, this is the very foundation of automatic reasoning. We are trying to infer not things which are true accidentally in some worlds, but which must be true in every world where our axioms, which means the facts that we asserted, are true. So in order to address this, and this is very recent work, I just highlight this. I realize I don't have very much time, but so this is the same domain. We added a little bit more information here, but they can change, and some things are simply accidentally true. And this is the work of two of my students. And what we have designed, and this is mainly the work of Zenwei, who was also here 2 days ago for our dinner. So some of you may have met them. So we have designed an algorithm called Falcon, which essentially, this algorithm, this is a forward function, but what it really does is so this is a forward function of a neural network, but what it really does is it uses fuzzy logic operators, in particular differentiable fuzzy logic operators, in order to decompose the semantics and then construct a model or an interpretation of a symbol in an ontology, so of a class or of a relation. And it does so while preserving exactly it uses fuzzy logic to preserve exactly the semantics. And in the end, we can prove that this is constructing a model whenever there is one. So this is an sound and complete ALC reasoner. So it's a theorem prover. You can use it as a replacement of Palette or Hermit for ALC. And we have this proof. It will always generate a model and only generate a model if there exists one. It can generate as many models as you want, so it allows the sound and complete inference or semantic entailment. It also does a lot of other things, so you can look at this paper. It's on archive at the moment. It's not published yet, but you can get the preprint and the code if you want to test it. But it can do reasoning under inconsistency, some paraconsistent reasoning, so it has a lot of interesting properties. So now, for the remainder of this talk, why do I care about this, and how does this actually have any impact? So lots of interesting methods, and they're very technical, and I realize I didn't go into too many details explaining why these methods are important. So that is now what I'm trying to do. Why do we want ontologies to matter, or why do we want to use ontologies in machine learning? What is even the point? Why do we want entailment, and why do I talk about deductive inference? So there are a number of different problems. So some domains have very little or no training data. Personally, I really like metagenomic dark matter, so proteins where we know nothing about. It's a hobby of mine, or it's a research area of my research group also, not only a hobby of mine. But then there are also some rare diseases where we just by their very nature have very little training data. Or if we take genotype-phenotype relations, yes, it works really great in white populations, but if we go to African population, Asian populations, it's very difficult to apply. So we don't have training data for this because we simply don't collect this data. And of course, emerging pathogens. So emerging pathogens are another one where we simply don't have enough training data, but we have to react very fast. And they will benefit from a number of different things. In particular, they will, well, we have mentioned this, or other people have mentioned this, in particular, Jobst in his talk before, inducing background knowledge is very useful. Yes, they will benefit from this. They also, but I will show you how they can benefit from combining prediction plus inference. And I'll show you this on the case of orphan proteins first. It's a very recent paper by Maksat. Mainly, it's called DeepGo 0. And the idea is, so you'll see that here is the EL embedding space based on gene ontology. So it's kind of based on gene ontology, and Barry will like this. Our proteins are actual classes, so from UniProt. And now what we have done here is, so in here we have added as training data some has function relations. But the idea is that our embedding of a protein, so our proteins, do not come from our knowledge base at all. They come from the sequence or some features from the sequence. You can think of they come from the structure or some AlphaFold representation or any kind of machine learning model. All it will do is it will project them onto a point or onto a sphere in the same space that our neural network has generated that captures the entailments of Go. So now what it can do is, we have this neural network on one side, we have our gene ontology on the other side. And what we can do is, on the right-hand side, we can simply read off whether our protein, depending on where it was placed, has a certain function. And we can do this even if our protein, if the function, we have never had a training protein with this function. So it's a function where we simply have never seen a protein, or our model never has seen a protein, because it could constrain it by relations, by quantifiers, and by a number of other constraints. And we have tested this, and this works. So here, this is not a zero-shot case on the left-hand side. What this shows is we compared it to some, we basically took out all the knowledge of a protein and its close orthologs, so that we don't have very similar proteins in there. So, we then divided our Go functions into those where we have how many training proteins do we have for this Go function. So how many proteins do we have that have these functions? And of course, to compare this, it's between, we have to start with 1. So this is 1 to 5. But what you can see is, if you have very few training instances, so this is what is called few-shot learning, then the difference, so the blue one is DeepGo 0, the orange one is the standard supervised classifier. So this knowledge-based zero-shot or few-shot classifier DeepGo 0 was much, much better then a standard classifier for the few cases, and at some point at around you have 50 proteins, so you have enough training data to train for this function. You can predict this function equally well with both, and at some point a standard neural network at around 100 or so, it will get consistently better than DeepCO 0. And on the right-hand side, you see this zero-shot prediction performance. So these are proteins where there are, these are functions for which there were no proteins. And this is from the Kappa challenge. So there were functions, there was not a single protein known with this function, including all the propagation. We predicted them. Then 1 year later in this Kappa challenge, they were experimentally validated. And people have found that we predicted this correctly. And depending on the function, and the function here, this prediction performance depends a lot on the number of axioms that constrain this class. So this is in the paper, it's not on the slide. Okay, I have a number of more stories. I mentioned pathogens. Of course, we can inject background knowledge, and I give this as an example because background knowledge we can easily inject here in almost any model, and I'll just give you 2 examples for this. But I start with pathogens. This was the master thesis of Lu Wei Wang, who is now at the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. But the idea is that we generate these embeddings from our ontology. Here he took as embeddings. The idea is, what do we have available at the start of a pandemic? Well, we know about the symptoms that this pathogen causes, and maybe we have some sequence information about this pathogen, so we have sequenced it, but we have not much else. What we want to know is, so he's predicting here host-pathogen interactions, and he uses the symptoms, which are basically phenotypes and also Go functions. So he basically links the symptoms to Go functions using these embeddings, embeds them. And then here he has a joint model, half of which is knowledge-based. This is based on the whether the interaction with a particular host protein could explain the phenotypes. So this is basically what these embeddings here encode. It's candidate pathophysiological pathways, essentially, and then he combines it with a sequence model. And here again, what you can see for this is you can see that this knowledge-based model essentially always outperforms. So this is a family-wise viral family-wise evaluation, and this orange is this knowledge-based model. The blue is using only the sequence. You can basically always do this with any machine learning model to inject some background knowledge, and you will almost always get an improvement when you generate this. On the right-hand side, he looks at the ranks at which he predicted the correct interaction. This was good for us because this was for COVID on the right-hand side. And we used a big COVID paper, one of the early papers which experimentally validated it or screened for these protein or host pathogen interactions. But this was 5 years into the pandemic, 5 months into the pandemic, 5 or 6 months, and we could have predicted a lot of them very early on using a model like this. And then something else. So this is basically a very similar method by my student Azza. So this is for structural variants. So I mentioned rare diseases. We have very little training data for rare diseases. We have even fewer training data if the rare disease is clearly due to aberrations in more than one gene. So here she's looking at structural variants where you have some big deletions or insertions in a genome and more than one gene are affected. And again, she combines this, she generates these embeddings, combines it with some sequence model, and in the end, it works really, really much better. She tests this also with different ontologies or combining multiple ontologies together, and she has a number of other structural variant prediction methods that she compared against. But you can see the difference here. I'm missing this, but this is the rank at 1. It's the first one. So how many times are you entirely correct? So the first one, you basically, this model identified it. Sorry, this is missing here. But you can see that these methods, which are not knowledge-based, they are much, much, much worse, almost by a factor of 10 below what a knowledge-based model would be able to achieve in this case. And then last one here, we have started building a library, Python library, which also interacts with the OWL API. So it's basically the algorithms are written in Python or Scala, and then it uses JPipe to interact between them. So you can use many of these methods. They're implemented this. Many of them are used in tutorials. You have Jupyter notebooks, and we are adding more and more algorithms, knowledge-based algorithms, as they are being published. It's not just the ones that we developed. We add a lot of other ones, and there are more and more coming. So if you are interested in using some of these methods, please have a look at MAUL. It's free software. Please send some pull requests for this as well. So this is the work of Fernando. And just to conclude, because I got basically 1 minute or two left. So what does this actually mean? Fine, will we need new methods, or will the ontologies have to change? Probably both. I focused mainly on the new methods now, and how ontologies need to change. There are a number of different requests that I would have on ontologies. So the first one is that exploiting the axioms, whenever you exploit the axioms, through semantic similarity, enrichment analysis, and here even more so, if you use machine learning or some kind of complicated embedding methods that actually do reasoning, then incorrect axioms really need to get out. And you can see this in Sarah's poster. So Sarah has a poster in the poster session. So she is basically just looking at some things which are simply wrong in HPO or in MP. And there are thousands of these instances, but by fixing this, you can actually get a significant improvement in a lot of different tasks. You can measure it directly. So it's something that I would really like. But the second one is that as long as our ontologies really only capture relatedness and not the semantics, so then we just have knowledge graphs, and we really should just call them knowledge graphs and not ontologies, because then any kind of machine learning method on knowledge graphs will simply suffice, which is fine for most things. And the question is, and we as a community really have to struggle to find out where precision, the ontological precision and rigor that we have fought for a long time, really matter. So, but one thing that I can tell you from my experience on using the machine learning methods is that negation and disjointness are really, really powerful to structure classification results. So they reduce the search space because they eliminate some solutions, and they move certain solutions that could not possibly be true at the same time very far away. So they're very powerful. And some of you have been at the talk in the Roby workshop. You've seen that adding that Sarah gave also. Otherwise, maybe she can explain it. But you can see that exploiting the disjointness and inconsistencies explicitly also can help a lot in improving machine learning methods. But ontologies should really enable deductive inference. And this is something that is not found in knowledge graphs. And it's also the hallmark, or at least one of the hallmarks, of any intelligent system. So with these methods, and with some of these methods, and we are, of course, they are being developed, and they are emerging, and they are not in production mode yet. But we are getting to a point where we can do deductive inference, actual reasoning, where we have world models in neural networks, and we can use them together for knowledge-driven machine learning in biology and in biomedicine, which can not only predict based on statistical relations, but actually perform deductive inference as our best reasoners. I'd like to thank my group at KAUST. So this is one of the latest pictures I have, and thank you very much. Chat online. I think Jim also has a question. Comment? Yes, there should. I have a mic.
Yes. I raised this one comment that I think that when we have a lot of these couple of years since the paper, so we continue to improve that. So yeah, I think I can talk more about together. So I really hope we have these.
Thank you very much. So Jim Belhoff just said that in the last 2 years in particular, since Luke's paper, there was a lot of improvement in mutual consistency of bio-ontologies, also by better tools. And there will be a talk tomorrow by him where he shows some of these results.
Any more questions?
I have a question about HPO. So I'm getting from your slides that HPO is full of errors.
That is the inconsistency slide, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Barry is asking whether the slides that I have shown mean that HPO is full of errors. And the answer is probably not. There are certainly some errors in HPO which can be fixed. What the slides have shown, and what Luke in his paper has shown, was that the ontologies are mutually inconsistent if you put them together. And when you analyze this directly, most of it is due, there are two reasons, I think. One is due to misuse of BFO. So people put them in well, maybe three reasons. Misuse of BFO top-level categories, not using the correct domain and range restrictions in the relation ontology, which moves classes into the wrong top-level category. Oh, I forget the third one. And there's not using it correctly. And the third one is using modules during development time, but not checking the consistency with other ontologies at the time of deployment.
I agree with everything said, but remember HPO does not use BFO.
So Barry mentions that HPO does not use BFO. And yes, you're absolutely right, but HPO uses a lot of ontologies that use BFO. So it uses the Go, it uses Pato, it uses Uberon, it uses a lot of other ontologies and imports them explicitly that do use BFO. So it still has a lot of ontological commitment related to BFO.
There's a long story.
Well, that was a real short part. I was trying to live tweet, but I couldn't keep up. I'll first address just the consistency issue. I think I'll come up with this talk again. I think it's largely, just a matter of combining two different versions of the same ontology. And it's important being solved. I don't, I actually want to come back more to again higher level about what you see kind of like way forward. I'm like really excited to see you making use of these other kinds of logical actions with people who go using holograph embedding to just throw away 95% of the matter. And I love that you're bringing in some of the negation sections as well. What are there other things you think we could be doing as ontology developers? Maybe even things outside our. Are there other ways that we can be constrained as we think about knowledge representation? Are there ways we can go about including knowledge, from the books and other sources to really, take us forward?
Yeah, great question. So Chris Mungle is asking what the way forward would be, what we as a community could do, what we could change, maybe by moving to other formalisms beyond OWL. maybe in order to have a broad impact, and what would also make the life of our users easier. I have no good answer immediately. So this is something so there are two things that do come to mind. There is a lot more work now, not on OWL or description logic, but on logic programming. So logic programming and machine learning. There is, DeepMind has maybe more than 5 papers on logic programming and machine learning. Also learning logic programs from data. Something that is quite exciting because it allows us to validate our ontologies from data. So it's still approximately somehow, but we can use it to validate. So this is one thing that comes to mind. And the second is there is another community which comes from knowledge graphs, but moving more toward first order logic, which is this logical query answering community. And there are 30 papers now or so, and it's something that really happened in the last year or last 2 years at most, which is something where a lot of methods are very relevant to what we are doing in bio-ontologies. But I have no comprehensive answer for you.